Welcome to East Bay DSA's Capital Class, lecture number, actually, I think it's 5, broadcasting from the East Bay DSA Center in Oakland here. And welcome to all who are joining from other places or watching later. I'm just going to jump right into things. So where we're at now, just to make sure we're all somewhat situated, most of the reading groups should have discussed chapters 1 through 9, which is through part 3. I am also going to cover a little bit of chapter 10 if we have time at the end, but that's getting into the section on relative surplus value, just having finished the section on absolute surplus value. And I wanted to just propose a little exercise rather than going through the sort of recommendations for working groups this time, which is just, I'll say I've done a couple of capital reading groups. People who've done these sorts of things before probably are also familiar with this. We're getting to this like grand part in the middle where there's some really long chapters. Some people are getting behind. It's also the summer. People are going on vacation. And so I think it's good just next time you meet as a group to do a little exercise to try to keep the group alive and keep it going well. And that would be just, meeting up, checking in. If there's someone who's been coming to the groups but is consistently a little bit behind, just be like, hey, jump ahead, stay with us. It's okay. You don't need to read every single page of every chapter. It's better to be with the group. And not everyone's going to watch this lecture, so make sure to say it. And then for everyone who, everyone, you look around the room, you're like, oh, this person came to a couple sessions, maybe go through your group chat list, right? This person came to a couple sessions, but they're not here now. They haven't been coming. Maybe pick someone to send them a text and be like, hey, I haven't seen you around. Even if you fall behind, it's good to come back again. Just start with us at chapter 10 or chapter 11 or whatever chapter you're at. And there's always the lectures to catch up to. So especially if your group is, angling towards 4 people, I actually think that's totally solid if you can hold it, but you're in danger if you lose one more. So if you're at about 4 people, maybe take some time to do this exercise to just, try to bring a couple people back, and it'll be helpful. That said, most of what I've heard is that groups are either going well, or if they've gotten a little small, have joined with others. So that's great. Okay. And that's it for getting people back into groups and some of the group stuff. Starting the lecture itself, I just wanted to note that, we're still continuing with this idea of capital as sort of layers on an onion, you could say. I'm no longer going to label each layer with a chapter because I think we've all sort of just gotten at this point, right? It's sort of coming back to the same ideas and concepts again and again. But in the tradition of last lecture, I wanted to go through some of what we covered through a different diagram. It's going to be a little more crazy in the inspiration of This Is Always Sunny. So I don't know if anyone's seen this diagram. It's probably familiar to some of you. It's from David Harvey. Yeah. And so I just wanted to quickly go through sort of his way of summarizing some of the arguments so far, right? Which is sort of working through some of how Marx is thinking, I'm going to say dialectical, right? Where he takes one thing and then he sort of says, well, what are the 2 aspects of this thing? And starts thinking about these 2 aspects. How are they different? How do they contradict one another? How do they relate to one another? And through working through those 2 things, you sort of come to a third thing that you have to look at. And that sort of moves you forward in the argument from step to step, right? So we started with the commodity. This is something all of us touch, interact with every day. It's a very, very familiar object if you think about it, right? It's pretty much anything you can get your hands on. And then seeing that there are actually 2 sides, 2 aspects to it, use value, exchange value. And that led us to understand, well, there's something underlying the exchange value. There's this value, there's this socially necessary labor time. But then we thought, okay, even though it's labor time, right, there's still those 2 sides to it. It's still, on the one hand, concrete, specific labor, and on the other hand, abstract social labor. That led us to think, well, really the only way we can think of it as a value is not because of it being abstract labor, but because of the actual way things are exchanged, the form of exchange value. That's the equivalent form, the relative form. I'll admit it's a little bit of a painful part of the book, but you get in the end through that right to the idea of money, that there has to be this real expression of the value in commodities, the money form. That brings us to the end of chapter 1, to fetishism, and to the idea that we have, social relations that are happening between things through money. and material relations between people. We're just relating to other people's products without actually talking to them. And that gets us to market exchange, the actual use of money. How do social relations between things become material relations between people? We have owners, we have buyers. That means we actually have to have money moving around, a real commodity money, which both has to measure value and has to circulate things. In those two aspects, we see that it sort of takes on these social qualities that make it a real embodiment of value itself, of abstract labor. And that gets us to, money being used as a debt or a credit, as in a sense, means of payment, and ultimately as capital, money becoming more money through interest, right? And so he's sort of working us logically through how when you start just with a simple commodity, you can actually sort of work and get to the point that you see, okay, not only do we need money, but because we have money, we need sort of, it becomes socially used and it becomes something like capital. It becomes something that's lent, that's becomes debt, and that gathers interest. But then he stops, right? And he says, well, capital, M, C, M prime. We're going to come back to that later this lecture. But on the one hand, if we're talking just commodity exchange, things should be equivalent. There's no way that M prime should be able to exist. On the other hand, it does exist. We see in the world all around us that things are driven by profit, companies are driven by profit, everyone is getting that M prime. So that's a contradiction. And we find its sort of solution in buying and selling labor power, which sets up this conflict between capital and labor. I would say one of the more dramatic moments in the book at the end of, I think, chapter 6, where he says, right, the capitalist walks out with a smile on their face, and the worker walks out with their sort of back slumped behind the capitalist. Having sold their hide, they have nothing to expect but a tanning. And so this is the sort of introduction of class struggle. And I just wanted to note, to bring it up through the chapters we've read now, right? We then get the valorization process, the valorization process and the labor process, right? So within the actual production, there's sort of two sides to it. And that leads us to understand that capitalism has sort of this unique production process that even though it's sort of carrying out the labor process, it's also always making profit. It's also valorizing. This leads us to the idea of constant capital and variable capital, which brings in the rate of exploitation. That gets to surplus labor and necessary labor, which brings us to the struggle for the working day. So I'll just note that, there's a lot of ways to think about the way Marx works through his argument. There's many books on Marx's method. But one of the ways that sort of David Harvey is showing here is this idea of sort of, starting with something very concrete, splitting it, thinking of it from two sides, following how your thoughts sort of carry you, and then that brings you to some new idea that you again think of from two sides. And that sort of carries us, in a sense, through the book, and hopefully provides us sort of a brief review for everyone who's, trying to remember the many chapters that we've read so far. And with that, I wanted to jump into part 3, chapters 5 through 7. This is the labor process versus the valorization process. It's also constant versus variable capital, and the rate of surplus value. So about 50 pages in the book. And I wanted to start, even though we just did that review, with a quick note of what concepts we're bringing in at this point. So if you remember from the last lecture, we sort of ended with this shift from the sphere of circulation to the sphere of production. And basically what we're going to start doing in a lot of these chapters is we're going to be taking some of these concepts that we've already built up, things like socially necessary labor time, but we're going to think about them in the sphere of production. We sort of built them up in the sphere of circulation and the sphere of exchange, but we're going to bring them down to producing and how things are produced. So the first one I wanted to just note, right, is this idea of value as socially necessary labor time, right? That value is a way of embodying the amount of social time that must be put into something for it to exist for us as a commodity or something we can buy. The second is that MCM prime, this profit seeking, is all around us, but we can't in the sphere of circulation just explain it. There should only be equal exchange. And the third is that we sort of found the answer to that contradiction in buying and selling labor power, which is really about the use of labor power in production. And so that's what brings us down into production. And we'll see sort of the class relationship in production. And then the last thing I want to note as just some review is just this idea we've been carrying forward with us of, Marx, when he thinks through things, is often saying, on this one side, we see how at all times, in all places, in all human societies, certain things have to happen. We have to use certain objects. We need to interact with nature and use things in order to live. We need use value. That means we need useful concrete labor. We need ways to sort of shape nature into the forms, the shapes that we need it. And ultimately here, the labor process is going to again fit in that category. So he's going to look at the labor process as this sort of universal human necessity that in all societies and all times, right, people have not been freed from work. We don't live in the Garden of Eden. And so we have to do some type of work to shape and create the use values that we use every day. On the other hand, how it works in actual history, the actual and historically specific social relations between human beings, right? That use values have a value and appear as commodities, that's historically specific. That the way we exchange all of these different commodities and that produces this sort of abstract labor that's embodied in them, that's historically specific. That's not true in the same way if you go back 1,000, 2,000 years. And by the same token, the valorization process, the way that capital produces more value than it began with and continuously expands itself, is a historically specific overlay or way of conducting the labor process. And so that's just maybe to inform and set the stage here a little bit. And I'll just say, I said this with a couple of these things, right? But whenever we think in these two terms, we're not thinking about two different things, right? We're thinking about two aspects of the same thing. So it's not that there's a use value over here and a value over here, right? It's the same object that has both. And same with the labor process and the valorization process, right? It's actually the same work, the same people going to the same place, doing the same work. But on the one hand, it's a labor process. On the other hand, within capitalism, it has this character of being a valorization process. Okay, so let's look at the labor process. And Marx spends a good amount of time on this, I would say. I personally find this stuff interesting. But he really digs into basically every piece and talks about the different ways the tools could relate to the raw material. But he's sort of trying to draw this sort of general abstract idea of what humans do when we work. And I'm going to do a slightly simplified version of it and just say, right, basically, whenever we're working, there's some sort of raw material that we're working on. In the extreme case, that might just be nature itself directly. But in almost every case, there's some sort of raw material. In this example here, it's wood. There's also some sort of means of production, some sort of tool, some sort of mechanism of transmitting our work to the raw material. In this case, it's not just, the chisel and the hammer, but also the work desk, the space, the entire means of production that's being applied to turn that wood into a chair. But at the same time, you need concrete labor. You need the actual carpenter doing actual steps and doing actual work to bring those two things together in a labor process and ultimately produce a use value. And so that's sort of the steps of the labor process, right? Is you have on the one hand the material, you have the one hand the tools, you have the actual work you're doing to create something useful. And I just wanted to go back to this slide, I think back from lecture 2, which is just noting, right, that every useful thing that we generally relate to every day only exists because of this human labor, which we can now say, right, only exists because of a labor process. So the coffee, this is an example here, right, the Starbucks coffee you could buy only exists because of the work of farmers, the work of people who are sorting and picking the beans, drying them, shipping them, roasting them, and ultimately the barista that actually works in the Starbucks shop, right? So it's only because of all that labor process that the ultimate cup of coffee comes to exist, and you can buy it for an amazing, $4 or whatever it is. And so I just wanted to note this because Marx says something here which I think is important to try to understand this, the way he's thinking about these things, which is, I'm going to just read the quote. For the purpose of considering the yarn's value, we're talking about yarn here, the labor time it takes to produce the yarn, we can regard as different successive phases in one and the same labor process, the different individual labor processes that have to be carried out, separated by time and space. All the labor contained in the yarn is past labor. It doesn't matter at all that the labor time that went into producing the yarn's components is deeper in the past. So, right, in the same way that we saw with the coffee here, we start with the growing but end with the brewing. All of that labor is sort of embodied in the existence of the commodity at the end. And in a sense, you can think of these steps as just different phases in one and the same labor process. I just did a little sort of a engineering type diagram there where they chart out exactly this. Sometimes people also call this sort of thing supply chain thinking, right? There's a lot of thinking that does some of this same work today too. Okay, so that's the labor process. What about the valorization process? How does the labor process actually happen under capitalism? And I want to note that basically we're describing here this MCM prime cycle, which is, you start out with a certain amount of money, you buy some commodities, you do some work. That's what we're finding out. At the end, you sell those commodities and you end up with more money than you started with. So you sort of translate one amount of value into even more. Excuse me, you valorize value. And this is, right, the goal or the driving force of capitalism pretty much everywhere. And so we're trying to understand sort of the inner drive of capitalism. And if we talk through just the same picture we just had from the perspective of the valorization process, we see that the different elements can sort of be categorized in different ways, right? So the raw materials, that represents past labor that's already happened. The means of production, that also represents past labor that's already happened. But the concrete labor, that's actually new value producing labor that's needed to create the use value, which contains both that past labor in the original value and some new amount, right? Some surplus value. And so a lot of what Marx is going to talk about here really is breaking down these two different ways that value is transferred from the original products into the final product. And so to just make that clear and sort of categorize them here on sides, right? On the one hand, you have the past labor that has already become embodied in a commodity. It's the congealed value that's transferred over to the final product during the valorization process. Marx talks a lot about this. If you've read it, right, he talks a lot about this sort of like transferring of value. And this really includes basically the means of production, which is the tools and the raw materials. On the other hand, you have the living labor, the labor that's currently being done as part of the labor process in which new value is created and congealed into the final product. And so this is the worker using the tools to transform the raw materials. And if you think about it from that lens of the socially necessary, right, the socially necessary labor, this is a new piece of labor that is socially necessary in order to create that final product. And so just like before, we talked about how there's sort of these different, right, different phases in one and the same labor process. We can sort of use that idea to think through constant versus variable capital. So constant capital. Again, Marx is just sort of developing these terms, right? So past labor, the transferred value, constant capital, these all end up being pretty much the same thing. Constant capital is that the capitalist uses some part of his money to purchase raw materials and tools that are needed for the labor process, right? So that's this part that's already been in supplier tier 1 or supplier tier 2 down in the image. This is actually a cotton or yarn production. So it's the cotton farming, the chemical, bleaching of the cotton, et cetera. But in general, these are past dead labor that are already congealed into a commodity with a value. And the value is simply transferred along to the final product, right? Because it's already happened. The labor has already occurred. And so it's just transferred through the labor process itself. The value doesn't change, and that's why we call it constant capital. So there is some logic to his pick of the word there, the constant, right? It's this sort of past labor that's just transferred along. On the other hand, we have the variable capital. Again, this is right, Marx developing up these terms of the living labor, the actual new work that's being done. So the capitalist, this is that second phase, right, in the labor process. The capitalist is using some part of their money capital to pay wages, to purchase labor power, or to hire workers. And this is the part, right, where the workers are paid based on the past labor that goes into their own reproduction. They're paid the value of labor power. We covered this, right? So it's the value of the means of subsistence, which is represented in the wage. So how much are we paid? We're paid the amount we need to live to the next day, which is a squishy amount, but is also relatively well defined. The capitalist then uses that labor power in the labor process. Living labor power, it creates new value based on the amount of the time worked. So there's two different numbers here, right? There's the beginning and the ending amounts of value. The beginning amount is the means of subsistence, the value of labor power. The ending amount is the actual amount of hours worked. That is this sort of variation. And that's why Marx calls it the variable capital, because it actually changes its size. It starts as one size and then grows. And this is really just developing an idea that we already presented in a past lecture, which for those of you who are new, I'll go over it again, but is basically that surplus value, the way Marx thinks about it, ultimately comes from this gap between how much time, how much socially necessary labor time does it take to produce the means of subsistence to reproduce day by day. And the image here, right, is just a drawn image of sort of an English working class district. So each of these little slices probably has multiple working class families. There's laundry, there's reproductive work, there's little bathrooms outside. It's this very condensed way of reproducing the lives of the English working class. By contrast, how much time do those same workers then actually spend working in the factories? How much socially necessary labor time do they do? And it's the gap between these two factors that allows for surplus value. And we can now call that gap something, or we can sort of further define it into necessary labor, right? The amount of time it takes to reproduce the means of subsistence, and surplus labor, which is the additional time beyond the necessary amount that the workers actually spend working. So it's the word for the gap itself. And so I just want to basically spend some time going through these two concepts. So if you remember that first motion, right, we're now at the rate of surplus value has divided into necessary labor and surplus labor. Okay. Necessary labor. I'll just say I find this to be a relatively hard concept to get around. I think there's a lot of ways you can sort of get it twisted. So hopefully people find it useful that I'm going into some detail with it. But I'll start by just sort of reading some Marx here. We have seen that during one part of the labor process, a worker produces only the value of his own labor power, which is the value of his necessary means of subsistence. And then Marx goes on to note, even though I'm saying it in my own words here, that the worker is part of a social division of labor. So when we say he produces everything he needs, that doesn't happen directly, right? It happens through exchange with others. Really what we're saying is that he's producing an amount of value, an amount of socially necessary labor time equal to the value of his needs, or he's getting the money that he uses to buy all his needs on the market. And so even if we assume here, right, this is sort of the Marx thought experiment. If we assume there's no capitalist, the worker's a artisan producer, they work their own day, they would still need to work at least, if the average daily means of subsistence is 6 socially necessary labor hours, they'd still need to work those 6 hours to produce enough value to later buy what is needed on the market to live. So, right, even if you were in this ideal sort of imaginary scenario without the capitalist, you'd still need to do some work if you live in this broader social division of labor. And so that's why Marx calls it necessary labor. It's necessary, as he says, for the worker because it is independent of the social form of his labor, and it's necessary for capital and its world because their basic precondition is that workers continue to exist. And so in a sense, this is the part of social production, right, that is going to reproduce the worker, is necessary for them, and is in that sense necessary for capital. But we know that the workday doesn't stop there, right? The length of the labor process can extend beyond just that necessary part. And so here it's that 6 hours, right? It can extend beyond, and the worker can be forced to keep working. And again, we did cover this idea in the last lecture, so I'm just going to bring back this image. But right, it's this difference between when you buy something and when you use something, right? So in this case, 2 pairs of Converse, both have been bought for the same amount of value. The same amount of labor is embodied in them, but one has been used a lot more than the other, right? So once you buy something, that's a different sort of relationship than the actual use of it. And that's what's happening here, right? On the one hand, the capitalist is buying the labor power, and now they're using it even more than the strictly necessary amount of time. And that brings us to surplus labor. And so Marx says in the first part of the workday, the necessary labor, the worker is in a sense reproducing the variable capital that has advanced. He says in a sense here, right? Because in a sense, it's also new value that's being produced, but he's in a sense reproducing. In the second part of the labor process, the worker moves beyond the limits of necessary labor. This still costs him labor. He is still expending labor power, but he no longer creates any value for himself. Instead, the worker generates surplus value, which smiles at the capitalist with all the allure of something he gets for free. And so this is, right, the second part of the day in which the wage has already been covered, and in a sense, the capitalist is making profit. And then I will read this last little section because I think it's just helpful for thinking through it, right? Marx says, all that distinguishes economic social formations from one another, i.e. the slave-owning society and the one where wage labor predominates, is the form in which surplus labor is squeezed out of the person who produces directly, namely the worker. And we're going to cover that a little more later, right? But part of what's happening when we try to understand capital is we're trying to understand in what way is capital able to, and as we'll see later, incredibly good at squeezing surplus labor out of the working class. Okay, so with that, I am going to come back to that sort of note later, but I wanted to just do a jump into taking a look at this labor process seen from the point of view of the final product. And so in this case, we're going to use yarn. I've got yarn up here. And we're going to divide up the final product of yarn into different parts. This is something that Marx himself does in, I think it's chapter 7, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But basically, he says you can sort of look at the final product this way, right? Of all the yarn that a factory produces, some part of it, in fact, a pretty substantial part, really just represents the value of the cotton, of the spindles, of the machines that are used. That's the past dead labor. Some part of it represents the value of the necessary labor. It represents the variable capital or the wages that the workers are paid. That, as you can see, sort of flows back to the worker. But then some part of it goes beyond that just necessary labor. It's the surplus labor, which becomes the surplus value or profit for the capitalists. And Marx basically is going to call this whole first part the constant capital as it gets re-embodied in the final product. And he's going to call the second part there the variable capital. And you can see why, right? Because it varies, because it grows from the variable original part, which is the wages that are paid, to the final part, which includes the surplus labor as well. And then he's basically going to say, when we think about the rate of surplus value, the rate of exploitation, we need to think about the difference between these two sides. How much of the worker's day is really something that in a sense you could say is necessary, even outside of capitalism, that, you know, on some level there might be some justification for having us work this long, versus how much of the working day is surplus labor beyond what is necessary. And so that's sort of the breakdown there of the various different parts. And I just wanted to present one image that I find pretty striking that he sort of presents. I don't know if anyone else caught this in the book, but he sort of describes this dunking where past dead labor or constant capital is taken by the capitalist and dipped into the ferment of living labor to soak it up, to soak up the new living value, and then become the final product, which is valorized, in which capital has achieved its goal. It's become more than itself. It's, achieved surplus value. And so he has this sort of, dipping of old dead labor into the living churn of the labor process to grow. Okay. And then I wanted to end with one of the loved and hated, mostly hated parts of the book, which is Senior's Last Hour. If any of you read through that part, but I'm going to just frame it in one way. I think there's a couple ways to think about it, but why is it important to distinguish constant capital from variable capital seen from the other side? What horrible or stupid mistakes do you make when you don't make this distinction? And I think it also just helps. We can do some questions at the end. It also just helps, right, to think about Marx isn't just randomly saying, well, I want to frame it this way because it shows that the workers are more exploited, right? He's trying to think about how the economy actually works, how these different parts of socially necessary labor are actually transferred into the final commodities that we buy. And if you don't recognize these ways, you end up in sort of very crazy mistakes, which is what happens with Nassau Williams Sr., pictured here. He's best known for defending child labor and the 12-hour workday and claiming that we really don't need to worry about the Irish potato famine because very few people are going to die. Those are his major predictions. In addition to that, he talked about this last hour idea where because, the factory is not really making any profits when you think about the final yarn that they produce until that last little bit, until the last hour, the worker is really spending the first 10 and a half hours of this 11 and a half hour workday producing their wages and only the last hour producing profits. And so we have to defend the last hour and not let it get taken away. This is against the Factory Act. Well, he's confusing constant and variable capital, right? Because we know that actually, if you look at the final product, only a small part at the end is represented in the workday. The bulk of it is representing past labor, the cotton workers' labor, the people who are making the spindles and building the machines. That's just transferred along. That's, in this case, right, 84% of the final commodity product. So much of the value comes from this past labor, from the constant capital. And then the variable capital and the wages, both the wages and the surplus value, are represented in just the end. And so if you do take away that last hour, you use less cotton and you use less spindles. And so the proportion of constant capital actually goes down or stays the same, but the amount reduces. Wages, as we've said, right, stay the same. But the surplus value, even though it decreases, stays basically, there's still plenty. There's still plenty left over. And so basically, if you don't see these different ways that value gets transferred from throughout the labor process, from its beginning when people, are farming or mining or doing the basic fishing, whatever the things that bring the first raw materials out of nature to this final step, you miss sort of the basic way that this value works, and you end up with mistakes, which were maybe motivated by other reasons, but mistakes like thinking the very last hour of the 12-hour workday is absolutely necessary for capital to make a profit. And so that's just, hopefully that's a way of both reading through that section of the book with a little more clarity and also seeing why this constant and variable capital is actually important beyond just sort of framing the workers as the central part of surplus value, which is also true. Okay. So with that, I'm going to jump into chapter 8, the working day. I really like this chapter. I know it's generally well liked by a lot of people, even though it's long and at times pretty historical. And so let's jump in. I'm going to start with just again noting, right, we're talking about surplus value coming from this gap between these two times, right? How much time it takes to reproduce the worker day by day and how much time they actually spend working. And the working day chapter is going to be really looking at this second amount. How does that happen? How do we decide how much time they actually spend working? And to do a bit of summarizing at the beginning, right? Marx is going to basically say, well, there's a conundrum here because there's no right answer. We know that there's at least some amount of time, the necessary labor time, that corresponds to the actual wages that workers are paid and the needs of the livelihood of the worker. We know also that we do still live in capitalism in this scenario, right? So unless there's at least a little bit of surplus value, surplus labor, the capitalist is not going to run their industry. But beyond that little minimum, there's this huge range of possibilities in which both the capitalist and the worker, in a sense, have a right to those hours of the day. And then Marx does say at the extreme end, right, ultimately, we still need some hours to sleep, some basic hours to, shove food into our bodies. So we need some basic time for reproduction. I put it here at the extreme, just 4 hours. But there is some ultimate physical limit to the length of the working day. But between that ultimate physical limit and the minimum amount of surplus value just to make the capitalist, start the whole thing in the beginning, there's this huge amount that's sort of undefined. And Marx even brings in characters. That's part of what makes this chapter fun. He brings in the capitalist who says, I paid for my commodity, I paid for a day of labor power, and now I have every right to use your labor power for that full day. What right do you have in saying, those hours are yours? I paid for them, they're mine. On the other hand, you have the worker, right? Look, you bought my labor power, but you only bought 1 day of it. You don't have a right to destroy my body. You don't have a right to leave me, living only 30 years of life. You don't have a right to leave me without dignity, without ability to, and back in that time often, ability to pray, ability to be with my family, to be a good citizen. You don't have a right to infringe on these other aspects of life to actually affect me beyond the normal working day. So you paid me for a reasonable day of labor and you're taking so much more. And that's why those hours are really mine. And so sorry, I wanted to make one more note here, which I'm going to come back to a couple of times, but just noting, right, that, you could think of this strictly as just the length of the working day, but that isn't actually how Marx thinks about it, right? Even in the chapter, right? He's also talking about the dust workers are breathing, the health effects, right? So it's about the working day, but it's not just about the working day. It's about all these various conditions that go into the labor process itself. It's about the minimum wage. It's about the conditions of work. It's about all these things that mean that the capitalist is getting a lot more than what they paid for. They're producing permanent health effects. They're, making you work a second job, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're going to come back to that a little bit. But I just wanted to note, it's not just the literal hours. It's a little more deep. But Marx basically ends with this framing, right? Between equal rights, if both capital and labor have some say about the length of the working day, force decides. And what do we call this? We call this the class struggle, right? The class struggle between the working class and the capitalist class. And this is a mural by Diego Rivera, if you're not familiar. And so that's really what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this little section. But I just wanted to note at the beginning, right, that we are now in a period. I mean, I don't know if you all discussed this in your own groups. We did a little bit in mine, but right, we are in a period in which you could say we're on the sort of other end of this class struggle. We haven't been winning, I'll put it that way. And so even things that we sort of presume, oh, we live in a modern world, there's a limit on the workday, even an 8-hour limit. Well, that's not really true, right? So many people are getting second jobs. So many people are doing all these things. You have here, right? Musk saying, if you work for my company, you're working way more than 40 hours, right? You have all sorts of gig work in which the length of the working day is not actually defined, and it pushes you to work more and more time or to be available for more time. And then you have a whole culture, right, of always being working, always being hustling, always being looking for the money. And so in many ways, not through the actual 8-hour legislation, right? We still have a legal 8-hour day in California. That has been pushed back and lengthened again. And I just wanted to sort of frame that. also as like, it's more than just the strict legal working day. And this is, you could even say, right, why the minimum wage is important. Because if you start having people working multiple jobs or doing these other things, right, it's important to say that it's not just you can only work 8 hours, but those 8 hours that you work have to make you enough to not have to work another job. So again, just there's this sort of broader set of conditions that are being fought over here. Okay, so how has this struggle played out in history in extreme brief? There's obviously so much to tell here, more than I could definitely tell even in this whole class, probably. But I wanted to start with sort of, you could say, the pre-capitalist, which Marx does sort of bring up. So what happens when economic forms like slavery and serfdom are pulled into selling commodities on the world market where the capitalist mode of production reigns? And Marx says basically the civilized horrors of overwork are grafted onto the barbaric horrors of slavery, serfdom, and so on. The goal was no longer to squeeze a certain number of useful products out of slaves. Instead, it was to produce surplus value itself, right? And so this is actually one of the first conditions that we see actually a lot of early revolutions, right? From Haiti, you could even say the Russian Revolution, you see a lot of conditions that are a little more this overlap of these various different things. But in a sense, what is Marx saying here? He's saying that if you go and look at slavery in Athens, for example, you're not going to find a master that's working their slaves so long because they don't have anything to do with the extra stuff. They only need so much, right? The whole economy is arranged around a certain use value of the sort of economic unit that they exist in. That is completely transformed by chattel slavery and sort of the integration of slavery into the world capitalist market. Same with serfdom. We've talked a little bit about this, I think, in the last class, last lecture, but just that there's sort of this transformation of how these modes work. And that is a huge part of, obviously, modern history. I want to go again to serfdom also, because Marx actually pulls at serfdom in particular because it has one trait that he really likes. He says it's particularly useful to compare the bottomless appetite for surplus labor under the corvée, which is sort of a serf form, with the equally bottomless appetite for it in the English factories. Because in the case of serfdom, surplus labor has an independent form that we can actually see, right? So if you're talking about serfdom or corvée labor, the necessary labor is done in a distinct place from the surplus labor. The peasant is working on their own plot, making their own vegetables, doing some of their own work. And then some parts of the day, they are forced to actually go to the Lord's land and provide some labor free to the Lord that all goes to him. There's this very clear distinction between what's a necessary part of labor for your own reproduction and what's surplus labor that's going to sort of a class overlord. In the case of the wage laborer, that is not true. And I think this is actually a pretty confusing idea, so I just wanted to walk through it, right? When we say necessary labor is 6 hours, we don't say you could work 6 hours and you'd have enough to live, right? Because within the work, there's no clear distinction between necessary labor and surplus labor. Instead, you're paid for your labor power. You're paid the necessary amount for your labor power, and that covers the whole workday, which all seems necessary, right? I mean, I'll even say myself, right? When I go to work, it doesn't seem like I could stop working halfway through the day and like, well, I'm done. No, because it all seems necessary to get the wage in order to live, a life, um, you know, in order to get the means of subsistence. And so part of what characterizes capitalism and which makes it hard to sort of dig into it is this way that surplus and necessary labor flow together as part of one working day. And the wage appears to cover that whole day, even though it actually covers only the value of labor power. Okay, and I'll just note, if you're more into the political side of things, there's a couple moments in this chapter, but Marx's general political position is that if you have conditions of serfdom or slavery, those are the immediate contradiction that needs to be overcome or fought over in order to free up a more straightforward class struggle between bourgeois and worker. And so that's how he thought of the US Civil War, for example. But once we sort of, you could say, move on past the sort of older forms, we get to the more classic capitalist conflict here, right? So in this picture, we have the capitalist at their house. You can see the factories in the background. You see the workers arguing, threatening in a sense. You see maybe the hint of a riot. There's some sort of strike that's going on. That's why they're all here, presumably. So you see this sort of classic play of worker and capitalist that in a sense, some of us are probably also familiar with even today, right? Even though the look of the buildings and et cetera is different, the actual play of the fight is pretty similar. Um, and so this is sort of where in a sense, Marx is more starting because he's looking at England. And he's basically going to tell this history of the establishment of a more normal working day. And hopefully you'll forgive me turning that into something that looks more like a diagram. But basically he's noting, and if you read the different sections towards the end of that chapter, right, that at the beginning, there's this long struggle to extend the working day in which the capitalists have brought the state onto their side. They're putting in workhouses. They're doing all these things to push the workers to work longer. And so there's this long push that sort of establishes early capitalist relations from the 1350s to the 1700. But then Marx has this sort of interesting note where he says, right, capital becomes powerful enough that merely the force of economic relations is enough to push the worker to sell the entire active period of their lives for the price of their normal means of subsistence. And so capital ends up, you could say in a sense, overshooting all reasonable lengths of the working day. And I think, when we read through some of that section, you really do get that sense. And why? How is it able to do that? Well, because of the way capital works, right? Why do you work? Because you're faced with starvation. Does the capitalist have to worry about your starvation? No, right? They can go hire another worker. They have no responsibility. And so in a sense, if you let that powerful economic force determine how long workers work unchecked, it will go way beyond what is in any way reasonable. And it's only in sort of the 1800s that through both extreme working class struggle and fight, mostly I would say, but also through legislation, through various other sort of political dynamics, there's the emergence of the English factory laws that constrain the working day back to 12 hours and then 10 hours. And so that's sort of this cycle of struggle, you could say, that Marx is talking through. That there's this period where the capitalist has the state on their side, they're in full advance. There's this period of sort of barbarous, seizing of every hour you can get, where the working class is living on average 30 years, all these sort of horrible moments. There's some calming of that with the struggle. But this goes on, sorry, and it doesn't end on our side. It doesn't come over and become a happy, nice place for the worker. It's actually oscillating through history and between equal rights force decides. And so, whether you're talking about sort of the early 1900s, where you have all sorts of struggles that play out on some level on this same terrain, you have the rise of the big communist parties, et cetera. Whether you're talking about periods of sort of more, late 20th century, where working class struggle seems to maybe disappear a little bit for a moment, but is still very there, and children are dancing in the fumes of, the factories, and all these different things are happening. Or again, right, in the periods of the 60s and 70s, this is a painting from Italy in the 70s, where you see another big resurgence, right? There's this sort of oscillating class struggle. There's this real class struggle that's happening throughout history, and that's sort of determining the conditions of the bargain between capitalist and worker. And so a normal working day, this is what Marx says, thus came about as the product of a protracted, more or less hidden civil war between members of the capitalist class and members of the working class. And this is, again, right, what we're seeing today, that we are, in a sense, on the losing side in many ways of an ongoing civil war that has led to all these various things, has led to the extension of the working day, but has also led to a lot of the morbid symptoms, I'm going to call them, that we see, today. So probably people are very familiar with this graph, the incredible rise in inequality, But it's not just this sort of more strict inequality. It's also, you could say, right, loneliness, the full atomization of people into everywhere, their little spheres, their feelings of unsurety. You could say it's also the stupid, plastic, ugly commodities that we're now given as if they're better than the nice things that people used to get. There's all these various ways in which this appears. And I would say on some level, right, it even appears in the way that capital seems to have no regard for the extreme planetary crisis that's running in on us, because they will be able to escape it by paying enough money. And so all of these, in a sense, you could say, are at least somewhat related to the loss of this civil war that's been ongoing since the 70s, at least, right? So that's a very big historical generalization, but in many ways somewhat true. I hope people sort of feel it at least. And I just wanted to end with a little bit more thinking about this quote, that the normal working day came about as the product of a protracted, more or less hidden civil war between the members of the capitalist class and members of the working class. And this is something that came up in our group. I'm not sure if it came up in others, but I just want to note that in this chapter, right, there's a contradiction, you could say. And it's something that has been noted in Marxist scholarship too, between how the class struggle is presented. Is it a fight for the normal working day, which, as Marx himself presents it, right, is the worker's right under the capitalist system as a commodity seller? Or is it a protracted, more or less hidden civil war, between the capitalist class and the working class? And that is, in a sense, right, a civil war. It's the material for a revolution, for an overturning of society itself. And hopefully this isn't too grand of a thing to say, but right, I think most people, when they really spend a lot of time thinking about it, come to land on the idea that both are true, right? That capitalism, because of the way it's structured, as we've laid out, necessitates this constant struggle between equal rights. That's part of its basic social framework. And it's from within this struggle, within the organization, all the stuff that occurs as part of it, that you have the possibility of revolution, the material possibility of moving beyond, of having the last come first, the workers come first. And so that's sort of how I'm hoping to present it. This is a painting by this guy, Vilanov, called The Formula for the Petrograd Proletariat, on the idea of what happens when the struggle for a normal working day goes beyond itself. So there's a lot that's sort of captured in this struggle, and that's there underneath this chapter. And it's my presentation of how you resolve that contradiction, you could say. Well, both are right. Okay, I'm going to jump forward and shift gears a little bit. So that was sort of about, right, the struggle. This is part of why I like that chapter. I think a lot of people like it, is that it's one of the first moments where Marx descends a little bit from the theoretical development into something that's a little more historical and a little bit more about class struggle. But I want to come back up to the theory a little bit and just cover again sort of where we're at with the rate and the amount of surplus value. And so to start, I just want to note that a lot of these concepts Marx is using here, they really refer to the same object, right? And so when he says variable capital advanced, well, that's also the wages that are paid to the worker, which is the value of labor power, which is the value of the means of subsistence, which is equated in the necessary labor time, right? In a sense, all of these things are referring to the same sort of solid point. And then again, we just covered this, right? But the workday, we said it's limited, but it's not determined. There's this sort of vast area within which it can oscillate and within which equal rights force decides. And it's that surplus labor that is the surplus value that the capitalist is seeking. And then finally, I want to note that Marx basically says the surplus labor over the necessary labor is the rate of surplus value or the rate of exploitation. And the contradiction here is that there's no constant capital. We talked all at the beginning about the constant capital, the past labor that's transferred over, but it doesn't appear here in the rate of surplus value. And so Marx sort of does this thought experiment where he says, imagine you're an individual capitalist trying to make more money. Well, one, you could exploit your workers more. You could lengthen the working day. Because remember, we're assuming here that the necessary labor is already defined. So you have to push the length of the working day farther, and you can get more surplus value that way. Eventually, you hit a limit. Workers need to sleep. They need the basic amount of time to eat. Well, you could also hire more workers, right? You could hire new people, buy new factories, et cetera. You could spend more on variable capital. But based on the analysis so far, the constant capital ends up being nothing but a burden, right? It doesn't create any surplus value. It just is needed as part of the production process. And this is this sort of contradiction that Marx is going to work on. And I don't know if others caught this. I feel it's there, but it's sometimes a little hard to catch. But he sort of has this funny moment where he sets all this up as the law. This is the law of variable capital of value. And then he says, the law obviously contradicts all experience based on direct observation. So he's self-critiquing. So he says, right, everyone knows that a cotton manufacturer, which in Marx's time, this is the example of someone who has a lot of constant capital, tons of machines, tons of cotton, tons of yarn. They spend a lot of their capital on the constant part, doesn't necessarily wind up with less profit or surplus value than a baker, who is, again, right, this example of basically all you need is an oven, but you need people working from the very, very well before the crack of morning till the end of the day. So the baker who advances a relatively large amount on variable capital. So this is sort of the contradiction, you could say, he's set up at the end of this section, which is that based on how we framed it so far, based on the fact that surplus value comes from surplus labor, which is extending the working day of a worker, of a living person, then the people who hire the most workers should be raking in the money, and the people who are, just buying a bunch of machines shouldn't be making much. And that obviously contradicts all experience. And so he does basically say that in order to understand this, we need some intermediate terms. And I wanted to briefly provide those with a quick look at volume 3, much requested. So this is going to go a little bit beyond what's in the book, but hopefully helps people think about it if they're curious. I want to start by just quickly actually pulling this quote from chapter 10, which I find very useful for sort of framing how Marx is thinking about it right now, right? So he says, for the moment, we won't be examining how the immanent laws of capitalist production appear in the external movement of individual masses of capital, or how they operate as inviolable laws of competition, thereby coming to figure in the consciousness of the individual capitalist as his driving motivation. So we aren't going to look at that, is basically Marx saying. We are in volume 3. Since we're moving to volume 3, we are going to take a look at those two things. But Marx is like, we don't need to look at this because this much is already clear. We can analyze competition systematically only once we understand capital's inner nature. And then he compares you reading the book to sort of like Galileo, right? Saying, you can't look up at the stars and comprehend their movements across the sky, really comprehend them without understanding the planetary laws of motion. Without that, you end up with a lot of various theories about what they mean. Not to critique astrology, but you don't fully understand their inner laws. And so he's sort of saying, right, that actually what I'm talking about in volume 1, the inner laws that are sort of governing the system of capitalism are much more important and are primary. But we are now going to jump a little bit to the external movement of individual capitals and the laws of competition. And so I wanted to do just a little bit of audience participation, actually, if someone could come and grab the mic and help. But I wanted to say, right, we understand from Marx that hired workers or variable capital are the source of surplus value. Given this, which of these two modern factories here would you expect to make more profit? We're going to get a couple answers. Anyone want to give it a shot? Yeah, Peter and then Simon.
I would say you can't tell just from inspection because it fundamentally depends upon how much does it cost to buy the robots versus what's the wage of the workers there, because if the robots are super expensive, then A makes more profit. But if like the robots are relatively cheaper than hiring people and dealing with like, the variation variable capital, then B will make more profit.
Precise answer. Yeah. Anyone else want to give a shot? Simon. Yeah.
Yeah. I think according to the law that he says contradicts all experience, it would be A, because there seem to be more people employed by variable capital in the production process.
Yeah. Thank you. That was the answer I was fishing for. But I will say every time I have asked this slide, and I've done it a couple of times, people have given good answers on both sides every time. Anyone else want to give an answer? Because there's plenty more to give. Yeah. In the back, John.
Just as an observation outside of the photos themselves, one can imagine that the robots can work 24/7 and the people cannot. So if you see the scenario on the left, that could be reproduced with another shift, perhaps, which would double the variable labor costs more than it would probably on the one on the right. On the other hand, the one on the right would have more maintenance, more repair, perhaps more wear and tear. I'm not sure. So you can't quite tell, but I do see the one on the right as having the potential, because it does it theoretically never has to shut down within the scope of what you see in the photo, and the one on the right doesn't have to shut down either. But you have to have a complete one or two complete shifts, replacement shifts of the human capital.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? Mike? Yeah.
I'll just say, yeah, A is living labor and B is dead labor.
Yeah, that's right. I'll just tell you this story. I had to write that first part to really indicate that the right answer is A in a sense, because everyone picked B when I first did it. So I had to rewrite and say, given that Marx says variable capital, but right, this is that contradicts direct experience thing that he's saying, that when you think about it, you're like, of course, the one with a ton of machines is going to be making bank. I mean, that's where you're making the money. But yeah, according to what we've learned so far, Simon and Mike are more precisely correct, but I think all answers are good, which is that since A is exploiting way more workers, there's more opportunity for surplus value production. Whereas B, there certainly are workers there, as you noted, John, doing repair and et cetera, but I don't see a single one in the picture. So what actually happens in this situation? And basically what I'm going to say, right, is that from the Marxist starting point, you actually have a capitalist economy. Well, the capitalists who've invested in this auto production and are making no money because only using dead labor, they're like, dang, I see all the money being made over here by A. I'm going to decommission my auto plant and start building a phone assembly plant, which I think is what's happening there, just FYI. And so suddenly all this capital moves over. More is making phone assembly. The price of assembling phones start going down. The price of making cars starts going up. And you end up at a situation, right, where based on that fluctuation, both of these two capitals are making an average profit. That's at least the tendency. Obviously, it doesn't, reach the tendency all the time, but that's the tendency. So if you're a capitalist, you see, if I could do this, I could make way more money, and I'm making no money doing what I'm doing right now. You sell everything and you move over to something else. And it's that process of sort of seeking profit that creates an average for society as a whole. And so this is, again, covered in volume 3. But basically, Marx frames this average profit as having a key role in organizing capital among the various branches of production. So why does capital as a system make enough shoes for us? Why don't they make 200 times more washing machines than are needed? Well, because there's this logic, right? If you make too many of something, you end up not being able to sell it at the same price or not being able to sell it at all. You start losing money. You de-invest. Other production processes are invested in. And so the profit levels moving around this average end up balancing the distribution of capital between all the various branches of production. And I'm going to note this again, but I'll note it here, right? That's based on the demand backed up by money. It's not based on real social need, but on social need backed up by who has money. And again, right, the mechanism, if you're an underproducing branch, people are paying more money, you're getting higher profit, and you attract new capital. If you're an overproducing branch, you get lower profit, leading to capital flight. Well, it's really the same process that is working with companies that have a lot more constant capital versus companies that have a lot more variable capital. Because they're part of this same great game, this same logic is working where people come in, they invest more, they produce more if there's an extra profit. And in the end, you end up as a capitalist having an equal claim on society's total surplus value based on the amount of capital you put forward. And so that's just a logical, hopefully that's coming through good. That's sort of a logical conclusion of what I'm saying, is that because all this capital moves to find the average profit, in a sense, anyone who has capital, no matter where they have it put, has some claim on the total social surplus value. And so you could say that all of capitalism is like one big global system. And each capitalist is like one member of this global system. And they get an equal claim to surplus value based on the amount of capital they put forward, which all tends to earn society's average profit. Obviously, that's just a tendency. You know, the very process itself is driven forward by surplus profits and losses and all these various things. But you could sort of imagine all of capital as a sort of cult in which all the capitalists are bowing down to one global machine exploiting surplus labor from workers. And even if you end up investing your money in, you know, I don't know, even if you're Apple, that's a good example, right? And you directly invest all your money in a couple tech workers and a lot of sort of intellectual capital in San Francisco, you make a lot more money than Foxconn, who is investing all their money in actual hiring of labor in massive factories. And so the way that the surplus value is basically divided among all the capitalists is working sort of according to this different process. And so I'll just say it one more time. I sometimes think it's useful in volume 1, when you're getting confused with some of this stuff, to just step back and say, one big social capital exploiting one social working class. That is sort of how Marx is tackling it there, because he's not getting into competition. He's not getting into the internal regulation between different capitals yet. Okay. I'll just note that was a simplification. Rent comes in, all these other things also come in that we're not going to cover here. But to sum up this section in very broad strokes, 1, capital developed within the production process to the point where it brought labor, the worker itself, under its command. Personified capital, which is the capitalist, now made sure that the worker performed his work properly and with the appropriate degree of intensity. And most people who've worked have a sense of this, right? You don't go to work and you're just totally free to do whatever you want. There's all sorts of systems of regulation to make sure you work about the right amount. And if you don't, maybe you're fined, maybe you're told off, maybe eventually you're fired, etc. 2, capital also developed into a coercive relation that forces workers to carry out more labor than the modest totality of their wants and needs calls for. It has displayed more energy, efficiency, and insatiability in producing industriousness in others, in extracting surplus labor, and exploiting labor power than all earlier systems of production based on directly coerced labor. And he says 3. Just to quickly say, these numbers are actually sort of how he sums up at the very end of chapter 9. He sort of says, here's the key points I want to pull out. 3, absolute surplus value is a practice of basically extending the workday. This practice has worked as well in old-fashioned baking houses as in modern cotton mills or even large tech companies today. And he notes, right, that at first, when capital first appears on the scene, it seizes onto a production process as it already finds it. And what does it really do? It extends the workday. It hires workers and pushes the workday as long as it can get. This is what happens when it first takes over baking industry in London, for example. But eventually it is going to transform that work process itself. I mean, every work process that we look at in our lives pretty much has been hugely transformed by capital. Even after that transformation, this process of abstract surplus value extraction is still going on. The workday is still being pushed, right? So it's not that you go from one and then you change into a different one. It's that there's always absolute surplus value extraction. And so this also applies even to the most modern workplaces. And then finally, I sort of like this quote. I like the imagery of it, but no longer does the worker use the means of production. They use him. Simply transforming money into the objective factors needed for the production process, into the means of production, also transforms them into a legal right to, and the right to coerce, the labor and surplus labor of others. This is an inversion, or really perversion, of the relationship between dead and living labor, between value and the power that creates it. And so there is sort of this frame Marx is giving of capital, right, where basically all of our past work as workers has taken on this form as dead labor, as constant capital, as all the machines, the factories, the things that now pulls our own life process away, ferments in us and pulls our living labor away in order to grow itself. And it's this sort of inversion or perversion of what should be happening, right? Which is where the work of past workers and our own past work should be a benefit to us and a blessing. And so I do actually have a little bit of jump into chapter 10, but maybe I'll do a quick check. How are people feeling? Are they feeling like, let's go for it for another bit? Really? Okay. Is anyone going to say no? Please feel free. I don't want to do it crazy. Okay, I'll try to be pretty fast. I want to give an introduction to chapter 10 and relative surplus value because we're going to be jumping into it next. And so the concept of relative surplus value, I will try to end by 4. So that's like 8 minutes. Okay, I just want to note that basically moving from part 3 to part 4, we're shifting between 2 processes of extracting surplus value. And both of these are very important to understand capitalism. And basically, these are the 2 that Marx is going to lay out. And so the one we just covered, the process of producing absolute surplus value is all about pushing that workday further and further forward. And I'll just say too, right, I think Marx basically condemns it outright as a process. All it is extractive. The one we're about to talk about now is this process of pulling back the necessary labor, reducing it from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 hours, and thus giving more room for surplus labor in the workday. And this, I would say Marx generally has a little bit more of a mixed view on. He has a lot of bad things to say about it, but he also appreciates, the reduction of the necessary labor, that we are much more productive as a species than we used to be. Okay, so that's really setting up this question, right? Is how do we reduce the necessary labor? And I'll remind you that we're making this question under certain conditions, right? We're not allowing there to just be cheating in the circulation realm. This is what we sort of did when we first went into production. We said, right, in circulation, we're taking the ideal case. Labor power is bought at its value in circulation. And so it's not that the capitalist is paying the worker less than they should. They're cheating them. I mean, in a sense, that's always true. But that's not what's driving this reduction, right? It's something that's happening in the sphere of production, underneath circulation, just like absolute surplus value extraction. And the answer is not that difficult when you think about it. It's productivity. So it's reducing the number of socially necessary labor time that goes to working people and their reproduction, the means of subsistence. If you remember this slide way back from lecture 1 and lecture 2, right? We used to make wheat a certain way. It used to embody a lot more social labor. It now embodies much, much, much less because of the utter transformation of the production process itself. And thus, we can feed a lot more people with a lot less social effort than we used to be able to. And so essentially that's what's going on here. So when you think of all the different commodities that we use every day, whether that's the food, the apartments, the medicine, the consumer products, the phones, et cetera, if all of that is fit into necessary labor, if necessary labor, you could say, is equal to the value of labor power, which is equal to the value of the means of subsistence, the question is, how many socially necessary labor hours go into those means of subsistence? And how would you go about decreasing those hours? And the answer really, right, is in front of us, or I guess hidden from us in many cases, all over. So I'll just let some of this play for a bit, but right, it's the insane productivity increases in pretty much every sphere of production that have occurred since, the 1820s. So whether you're talking about agriculture, this is sort of, modern farming up in the top, whether you're talking about producing industrial products like washing machines, which themselves are actually about increasing the productivity of reproducing people in the household, right? Making washing clothes much easier, building buildings. It's insane. I think this was a 57-story building built in less than a month. Or, producing cloth, producing the shirt that back then was the first origin industry of capital, the cotton and textile industry, and is still going strong. So in all these cases, right, insane productivity increases have meant that a lot less socially necessary labor goes into these products. When you think about that from the overall perspective, this again is a slide from the last lecture, right? But we sort of developed this overall picture of circulation. Well, what is going on when we reduce the amount of socially necessary time that's going into the means of subsistence? Effectively, we're growing the amount of time that can be devoted to producing for the needs of the rich, and we're shrinking the amount that will come back to the working class. And so this is the relative surplus value dynamic. And I want to just put it one other way, which is taking this framing from Adam Smith, actually. He has this famous / infamous story of an invention. One of the most important inventions on the steam engine was created when a little 13-year-old boy was working on this great steam engine, pulling this lever back and forth, and then realized that if he tied what he was pulling to another part of the machine, it would do his job for him. And Smith says this is this great joy of productivity because the child just wants to play, just wants to fish. And so, of course, they're going to make all these inventive changes to the machine in order to get their free time. Well, as we know, and as Marx notes in chapter 8, this is a total lie, right? That kid, what do they have to expect from advancements in machinery, advancements in technology, advancements in productivity? They have to expect either unemployment and starvation, poverty, or the exact same workday, but doing a different task. Because they're not used to bring down the workday. They're used to open up more space for surplus value. And so that's why, when people today hear automation, productivity increase, they're not like, oh, great, I get to work less, right? We're still in this same condition where when we make an invention or when an invention happens, we don't end up getting to fish at the end of the story. And so that, again, is relative surplus value extraction. And this is generally how technological advancement works in capitalism. And so I'm going to maybe just pause it there rather than going through what's happening here, because we're at 4. So I'm going to call it the end. I'll get to some of this stuff in the next lecture, but I'll just say, jumping back to volume 3 a little bit, talking about how relative surplus value actually appears for the individual capitalist. But with that, let's jump to that the next time and the end. I'll take a couple questions and yeah, thank you. Does someone have a second mic? Is that you, Molly? Thank you. I see Simon.
Yeah, thank you. I guess this is just a looking forward question to relative surplus value, because I know that's what we'll talk about next time. But does that relative surplus value concept, is that sort of the thing that does help us explain our intuition that a more highly automated workplace is going to be more productive of surplus value for the capitalist.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Because presumably, like people said with the robots, they're bringing in the robots because it's cheaper than hiring workers, i.e., overall, it's increasing productivity. And that increase in productivity is shortening the workday, which we've just covered from a society-wide level, right, is leading to this effect. But if we zoom down and say, why did this individual capitalist replace this individual worker with a machine? We do have to explain it a little bit of a different way, which is what I didn't get to, but is basically right that they also get a benefit from being part of this systemic trend towards productivity increase, which tends to be a systemic trend towards replacing workers with robots and advanced machines. Not in every case, but in some cases. Thank you.
Just a question about relative surplus value and what happens now in the present era when the, let's say, rent keeps going up. So the means of subsistence keeps increasing. It's like capital, because of capital infiltration into the housing market. So help me to understand that, Daddy.
I'll say we will cover rent at some point, even though it's also from volume 3. I will cover it in one of these lectures. I think it's different than what we've talked about so far. But up until the point where he really covers it, Marx thinks of all of surplus value as just one big amount, right? So that includes rent. It also includes interest on all sorts of capital. It includes profits. It includes the salaries of the richest people in the world who are making their money by actually working as capital, right? It includes all of that. And when you think of it that way, all that rent that someone's paying should be considered part of the surplus value, not part of their necessary means of subsistence. It's just taken in a different way. So that's my quick answer. We will get to it. And essentially, rent is like a necessary part of regulating a market. And then it has all sorts of, I would say, not quite rational effects, some of which are sort of monopoly rents and land rents that end up being sort of almost feudal extractive powers to pull surplus value out of the rest of society, which is how I'd roughly characterize the landlord class these days. So yeah, not the best answer, but hopefully that gets at some of what you're asking. Any other questions? Yeah, Peter.
This isn't so much a question, but an observation. It's interesting that Marx kind of centers like the battle for like the working day above even like a battle for like wages. And like he knows that like the number one priority of workers at the time are just like reducing the working hours even at the cost of reduced wages. But it's interesting that sort of like struggle basically fell off entirely after World War II. After like around that point, the labor movement would only agitate for like increased wages and benefits, but not for like a continued reduction of working hours with, the rise of productivity in the post-war period. It makes me wonder, should socialists explicitly like make reduction of working hours a central demand again?
Yeah. Yes and no, I guess. I'll say hopefully this is a helpful answer, but I actually think that there's less division between those two things than it sometimes seems. And it's easier to think about this in the modern world where, right, like if you are working at a minimum wage, say outside of California, you're making $7.25 an hour and you're working at Walmart or something. It doesn't matter that you only can work 8 hours at Walmart. You don't make enough. And so actually the wage being that low is in effect an extension of the workday because you have to go and find another capitalist to employ you for another period of hours in order to make ends meet. So you have to get 2 jobs, or you have to be doing all these other things on the side, or you have to be living really a hard existence. And so I think there's probably good reason that Marx framed it in his time as like the working day. That was the key way it was fought over at that time. But actually, a lot of these other fights over sort of, conditions, intensity, and even wages are also in a sense over the working day, I think. And it's about, if I make this much more in wage, can I retire a little earlier? That's a reduction in the working day. Can I get rid of this second job? Do I not have to, make my kid go get a job when they turn 16 or make them work through college? In many ways, these are all sort of related as one fight over, the working day, i.e., how much is capital going to give us? And if we need a certain amount, how long do we have to work? How many surplus hours do we have to work? But given that, I think we should be a little flexible as socialists about how we frame our demands and include in key demands, not just the reduction of the working day, which is important, but also things like the minimum wage, conditions at work. I think we should be looking to the workers in a workplace to frame what is needed. But all those are parts of sort of pushing back on how capital steals time beyond the normal working day.